I'm 70 years old, but I still hear his voice. It whispers to me in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, when the house settles into that particular stillness that only comes at dawn. No one will believe you, Evelyn. Even now, after all these years, after everything I've learned about healing and truth, Raymond's words still echo in the chambers of my heart like a prayer I never wanted to learn. My name is Evelyn Margaret Foster, and this is the hardest story I've ever had to tell. But it's also the most important one. I was born in 1954 in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, into what everyone called a spiritually strong family. My mother, Dorothy, had been one of Jehovah's Witnesses since the early 1950s, back when the organization was still relatively small and tight-knit. She'd converted after my father's tragic passing in the Korean conflict, finding solace in the promise of a paradise earth where families would be reunited forever. By the time I came along, the Kingdom Hall on Elmwood Avenue had become the center of our entire universe. Our Thursdays were for the Theocratic Ministry School, where even us children had to give presentations about Bible topics. Sundays meant the Watchtower study, where we'd sit in rows of metal folding chairs, raising our hands to answer questions that had predetermined answers printed right there in the magazine. Tuesday evenings were for the book study, usually held in someone's living room, where the smell of instant coffee mingled with the scent of well-worn Bible pages and the faint trace of whatever perfume Sister Williams wore. Something floral that reminded me of the lilacs that grew wild behind our duplex. But it was the field service that defined our Saturdays. Every weekend, we'd gather at the Kingdom Hall at 8 in the morning sharp, armed with our book bags stuffed full of Watchtower and Awake magazines, ready to spread the good news door to door throughout Cedar Rapids. I remember the weight of that bag on my small shoulder, how the leather strap would leave marks on my skin, and the way my stomach would flutter with nervous energy every time we approached a new house. We lived in a small duplex on the east side of town, where the houses were built close together and everyone knew everyone else's business. Our side had 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen with linoleum floors that curled up at the edges, and a living room where Mother had arranged our furniture to face the corner where she'd hung a framed picture of paradise. Lions lying down with lambs, children playing in perfect gardens, all of us smiling in flowing white robes. This was my world, bounded by the rhythm of meetings and field service, shaped by the constant anticipation of Armageddon and the promise that any day now, this old system of things would pass away and God's kingdom would rule the earth. I believed it all with the fierce certainty that only a child can muster. And then there was Raymond. Raymond Carlisle was 17 years older than me, the product of my mother's first marriage to a man who died in a factory accident when Raymond was just 12. By the time I was old enough to form clear memories, Raymond was already 21, baptized, and well on his way to becoming what the organization called a fine young man with spiritual goals. He'd been appointed as a ministerial servant when he was 19, and everyone spoke of him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for the circuit overseer. "Your brother Raymond is such a blessing," Sister Thompson would tell my mother after the meetings, her voice carrying that particular tone of admiration that adults used when they spoke about the spiritually mature ones. "He has such a gift for explaining the Bible. The young people really look up to him." And they did. Raymond had a way about him, tall and lean, with dark hair that he kept neatly combed and glasses that made him look scholarly and wise. When he gave talks from the platform, his voice carried a confidence that made even the elders nod approvingly. He could quote scripture from memory, explain complex doctrinal points with clarity, and had that rare ability to make even the most rebellious teenagers pay attention during the ministry school. At home, he was different, quieter, more watchful. Raymond lived with us until I was about 8, saving money while he worked at the John Deere plant and pursued what Mother called his theocratic goals. He had the smaller bedroom next to mine, separated only by a thin wall where I could hear him moving around at night, the creak of his bed, the rustling of pages as he studied for his next talk or meeting part. Mother adored him. "Raymond is going to be an elder someday," she'd say, as she ironed his shirts for the meetings, pressing each collar with the careful attention of someone handling something sacred. "He's so dedicated, so mature for his age. I'm so proud of both my children." But even then, at 8 years old, Something about Raymond made me feel small and uncomfortable in ways I couldn't name. It was the way he looked at me sometimes during family study, how his eyes would linger just a moment too long, the way he'd volunteer to help me with my book bag or offer to review my ministry school presentations, always finding reasons to be alone with me in my room. "Evelyn needs extra help with her Bible study," he'd tell Mother, and she'd beam with pride at having such a caring, spiritually minded son. If only she had known what kind of help Raymond really had in mind. Raymond was 22 when he was appointed as an elder, making him one of the youngest men ever to receive that responsibility in our circuit. The announcement came during a Thursday evening meeting in late autumn, when the Iowa wind was already carrying the promise of winter, and the Kingdom Hall's old heating system made those familiar clicking sounds that punctuated every gathering. "We're pleased to announce," said Brother Patterson, the presiding overseer, his voice carrying across the small auditorium, "that Brother Raymond Carlisle has been appointed to serve as an elder in this congregation." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. I watched from my seat in the third row, flanked by Mother on one side and Sister Evans on the other, as Raymond stood to acknowledge the recognition. He was wearing his best suit, the navy blue one Mother had helped him pick out at Penny's, and his face carried that expression of humble gratitude that we'd all been taught to display when receiving privileges in the organization. "Thank you, brothers and sisters," he said, his voice steady and warm. "I don't take this responsibility lightly. I pray that Jehovah will help me shepherd this flock with the love and wisdom they deserve." Mother reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with tears of pride. "Your brother is truly blessed by Jehovah," she whispered, and I nodded dutifully, trying to match her enthusiasm, even as something cold and uncertain settled in my stomach. This was during the winter of 1968, when I had just turned 14 and was beginning to notice things about the adult world that had previously escaped my attention. The way certain elders' wives deferred to their husbands with an almost fearful compliance. How some of the teenage girls in our congregation seemed to withdraw into themselves after spending time in shepherding calls with older brothers. The peculiar silence that would fall over conversations when certain subjects were mentioned. But Raymond's appointment changed the dynamics of our household in ways that were both subtle and profound. Suddenly, his word carried even more weight with Mother. When he suggested modifications to our family study routine, she implemented them immediately. When he recommended certain publications for my personal reading, they appeared on my bedside table within days. When he offered to take over more of my spiritual education, Mother practically glowed with gratitude. "Having an elder in the family is such a blessing," she'd tell the other sisters after meetings. "Raymond takes such a personal interest in Evelyn's spiritual development. She's so fortunate to have such guidance right here at home." The guidance began innocuously enough. Raymond would knock on my bedroom door around 8:30 in the evening after Mother had settled into the living room with her needlework and the evening television programs she allowed herself as relaxation after spiritual activities. "Time for our Bible study, Evelyn," he'd say, carrying his well-worn New World Translation and a notebook where he'd jotted down discussion questions. "I've prepared some special material just for you." These sessions were different from our family study, more intimate, more focused on what Raymond called my unique spiritual needs as a young sister approaching womanhood. He'd sit on the edge of my bed while I remained at my small desk, and we'd discuss passages about submission, obedience, and the special role that Jehovah had designed for women in his organization. "The Apostle Paul tells us that women should learn in silence with full submissiveness," Raymond would explain, his finger tracing the scripture in his Bible. "This doesn't mean women aren't valuable, Evelyn. It means God has given you a special role that requires different qualities than what he expects from men." At first, these conversations felt like an extension of what I was learning at the Kingdom Hall and in our publications. The importance of modesty in dress and conduct, the need to guard against the worldly influences that might corrupt a young person's thinking, the beauty of preparing oneself to be a good wife and mother in God's new system. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the tone began to shift. "You're developing into a young woman now," Raymond observed one evening in early spring, when I was wearing a simple cotton dress that Mother had sewn for me. "It's important that you understand how your body affects others, especially the brothers in the congregation. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, the kind of embarrassed confusion that 14-year-old girls experience when adults suddenly start noticing their changing bodies. "I don't understand," I said quietly. "Of course you don't," Raymond said, his voice gentle and patient. "That's why Jehovah has provided you with spiritual guidance. You see, Evelyn, when a young sister begins to mature physically, she has to be extra careful about how she conducts herself. The way she sits, the way she walks, even the way she breathes. All of these things can cause improper thoughts in the brothers around her." He moved from the edge of the bed to the chair beside my desk, closer now, close enough that I could smell his aftershave and see the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident. This is why Paul counseled young women to dress modestly and behave with proper submissiveness. Not because there's anything wrong with your body, but because men are visually oriented creatures, and you have a responsibility not to become a stumbling block. These conversations began to include more specific instructions about posture, about the length of my skirts, about the way I should conduct myself during meetings and field service. Raymond would demonstrate proper sitting positions, proper ways to arrange my book bag, proper methods for getting in and out of cars during service. His hands would guide my shoulders, adjust my posture, linger just a moment longer than felt comfortable. "Like this, Evelyn," he'd say, his hands on my waist as he showed me how to sit with my knees properly together. "Remember, every brother in the Kingdom Hall is watching how the young sisters conduct themselves. You want to be known for your modesty and spiritual mindedness, not for causing distractions." Mother noticed the extra attention Raymond was giving to my spiritual education, and she was delighted. "Raymond is such a wonderful example," she'd tell Sister Williams during their Tuesday afternoon visits. "Evelyn is so blessed to have such patient, thorough guidance. I just don't know what we'd do without him." What she didn't know was how those guidance sessions were changing, how Raymond's instructions were becoming more personal, more invasive, more focused on parts of my body and behavior that no elder should have been discussing with a 14-year-old girl. How his touches were lasting longer, moving to places that made me feel confused and ashamed. "This is between us, Evelyn," Raymond would say at the end of each session, his hand resting on my shoulder in what anyone observing might have mistaken for brotherly affection. "Your spiritual education is too important to be interrupted by misunderstandings. Some people might not understand the depth of instruction that a young sister requires." I trusted him because I'd been taught to trust spiritual authority, because everyone spoke of Raymond with such admiration and respect, because Mother beamed with pride every time someone complimented her son's spiritual maturity and leadership qualities. I trusted him because I was 14 years old and had been taught that questioning spiritual authority was the same as questioning Jehovah himself. "Remember what we discussed about submission and obedience," Raymond would say as he closed his Bible and gathered his notes. "These lessons are preparing you to be the kind of woman that Jehovah can truly bless." And then he'd leave me alone in my room, confused and uncomfortable, but convinced that these feelings were just part of my own spiritual immaturity, my own failure to appreciate the special attention I was receiving from such a respected elder. If only I had understood then what I know now, that predators always begin with words before they move to actions, that they always use authority and trust as weapons, that they always convince their victims that the abuse is somehow a form of love or care or spiritual guidance. But I was 14, and Raymond was an elder, and in our world, that was all the authority he needed. The physical abuse began on a humid Thursday evening in June, just 3 weeks after my 15th birthday. Mother had gone to visit Sister Martinez, who was recovering from gallbladder surgery and needed help with her meal preparations for the weekend circuit assembly. She'd be gone for at least 2 hours, maybe 3 if Sister Martinez needed additional assistance with her laundry. "Evelyn," Raymond called from the living room, "it's time for our Bible study." I was in the kitchen, finishing the dinner dishes and listening to the radio quietly, one of the few worldly pleasures Mother allowed in our home, as long as we kept it tuned to the local news station. The evening light was filtering through our small window above the sink, casting everything in that golden glow that makes even the most ordinary moments feel somehow significant. "I'll be right there," I called back, drying my hands on the towel Mother had embroidered with tiny yellow flowers. I was wearing a simple blue dress, one that Mother had approved as appropriately modest, with sleeves that came to my elbows and a hemline that fell well below my knees. When I entered my bedroom, Raymond was already there, seated not in his usual chair beside my desk, but on my bed, his Bible open beside him. He'd removed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, and there was something different in his expression, something I'd never seen before, but that made my stomach tighten with an instinctive unease. "Close the door, Evelyn," he said quietly. "Tonight's lesson requires complete privacy." I hesitated for just a moment, my hand on the doorknob, something deep in my consciousness sending warning signals that I didn't yet know how to interpret. But this was Raymond, my spiritual teacher, the elder that everyone respected and admired, the man Mother trusted completely with my spiritual education. I closed the door. "Sit here beside me," Raymond said, patting the space on the bed next to him. "Tonight we're going to discuss some very important topics about purity and a woman's role in God's arrangement." I sat down carefully, maintaining what I thought was an appropriate distance, my hands folded in my lap the way I'd been taught was proper for young ladies. Raymond opened his Bible to a passage in Ephesians, but instead of reading from it immediately, he turned to face me more directly. "Evelyn, you're 15 now. That means you're approaching the age when you'll need to understand certain aspects of God's design for men and women that we haven't discussed before." His voice was gentle, almost paternal, but there was an undercurrent of something else that I couldn't identify. These are sacred mysteries that only mature Christians can properly understand. He began reading from Ephesians chapter 5, the familiar passage about wives submitting to their husbands. But his interpretation was unlike anything I'd heard from the platform at the Kingdom Hall. According to Raymond, submission meant much more than simple obedience. It meant complete surrender of one's will, complete trust in masculine authority, complete willingness to accept guidance even when it didn't make sense to the feminine mind. "You see, Evelyn," he explained, his hand moving to rest on my shoulder, "women are designed by God to receive instruction from men. Your body, your mind, your spirit, all of it is created to respond to proper masculine leadership. That's why you feel confused sometimes during our studies. That's why you have questions you can't articulate. Your feminine nature is responding to spiritual authority the way God intended." His hand moved from my shoulder to my arm, his fingers tracing patterns on my skin that made me feel uncomfortable and confused. "But this kind of instruction can't be given in public, Evelyn. It's too sacred, too personal. The other sisters in the congregation aren't ready for this level of spiritual understanding. That's why Jehovah has blessed you with private instruction from someone who truly understands his will." I wanted to move away, wanted to ask questions about why this felt so different from anything we'd learned in our publications. But Raymond's authority as an elder, combined with years of conditioning about feminine submission and spiritual obedience, kept me frozen in place. This is what the Apostle Paul meant when he wrote about women learning in silence. Raymond continued, his hand now moving to my back, ostensibly to guide my posture, but lingering in ways that felt invasive and wrong. "True spiritual education requires complete trust, complete openness, complete willingness to receive instruction even when your human understanding rebels against it." That night, Raymond's instruction crossed boundaries that I didn't even know existed. Under the guise of explaining biblical principles about purity and feminine submission, he touched me in ways that made me feel sick and confused and ashamed. When I tried to pull away, he reminded me gently but firmly about the importance of trusting spiritual authority. "This is difficult for you because you're still spiritually immature," he said when I began to cry. "But Jehovah is preparing you for something special, Evelyn. You're receiving instruction that most sisters never get. You should feel honored, not frightened." When it was over, when Raymond had finally closed his Bible and straightened his tie and told me to wash my face before Mother returned, I sat alone in my room feeling as though something fundamental had been broken inside me. I didn't have words for what had happened, didn't have a framework for understanding that what Raymond called spiritual instruction was actually something else entirely. "Remember, Evelyn," Raymond said before leaving my room, "this is between us and Jehovah. Mother wouldn't understand the depth of instruction you're receiving. The other elders might be jealous that you're getting such personal attention. And the sisters in the congregation, He shook his head sadly. They'd probably spread gossip and rumors that would damage both our reputations. You don't want to be responsible for stumbling others, do you? I shook my head, tears still streaming down my face, my 15-year-old mind trying to process information that was far too complex and traumatic for me to handle. Good girl, Raymond said, his voice returning to that gentle, paternal tone that everyone in the congregation found so reassuring. I'm proud of how mature you're becoming. Jehovah is going to bless you greatly for your obedience and discretion. The pattern continued for months. Every time Mother left the house for extended periods, Raymond would announce that it was time for my special Bible study. The sessions became longer, more invasive, more focused on what he called my spiritual development, but which left me feeling dirty and confused and trapped. During congregation meetings, I would watch Raymond giving talks from the platform, see the respect and admiration in people's faces, hear the applause after his presentations, and feel as though I was living in two completely different realities. There was the public Raymond, wise, spiritual, respected, admired. And there was the private Raymond, the one who used scripture to justify things that made me feel sick and ashamed. You're so blessed to have such a spiritually mature brother, Sister Thompson told me one Sunday after the Watchtower study. Raymond always gives such insightful comments. You must learn so much from him at home. If only she knew what I was learning. I tried, in small ways, to resist. I would find excuses to stay in the kitchen when Raymond called for our studies. I would position myself near the door, hoping to maintain some sense of escape. I would ask questions about why our private studies were so different from what we learned at the Kingdom Hall. But Raymond always had answers, always had explanations rooted in scripture and spiritual authority. When I expressed discomfort, he reminded me about the importance of trusting those whom Jehovah had placed in authority over me. When I asked why our studies had to be secret, he explained about the spiritual immaturity of others and the danger of causing stumbling through misunderstanding. You're being prepared for something special, Evelyn, he would say during the worst moments when I was crying and asking him to stop. This is how Jehovah trains his most faithful servants, through difficult experiences that others wouldn't understand. And because I was 15 years old, because I'd been raised to trust spiritual authority without question, because I had no other framework for understanding what was happening to me, I believed him. The breaking point came on a cold February evening during my 16th year. Mother had gone to help with preparations for the circuit assembly, and Raymond had called for what he described as a very special Bible study. But that night, something in me finally rebelled. I don't want to have our study tonight, I said, standing in the doorway of my room instead of entering. I'm not feeling well. Raymond's expression changed in a way I'd never seen before. The gentle, paternal facade slipped just enough to reveal something harder, more calculating, more threatening. Evelyn, he said, his voice still quiet but carrying a new edge. You know better than to refuse spiritual instruction. What would Mother think if she knew you were becoming rebellious? What would the elders think if they learned that you were rejecting the special attention you've been receiving? I just want to be left alone tonight, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Sit down, Raymond said, and for the first time it wasn't a request, but a command. We need to discuss your attitude problem. When I didn't move, Raymond stood up and walked to where I was standing. He placed his hands on my shoulders, not gently as he had in the past, but with enough firmness to make it clear that I didn't have a choice. You're going to sit down, he said quietly, and we're going to have our study. And then we're going to discuss what happens to young sisters who start thinking they know better than their spiritual overseers. That night, Raymond's mask slipped completely. For the first time, he stopped pretending that what he was doing was spiritual instruction and made it clear that it was something else entirely. For the first time, he used physical force instead of just spiritual manipulation. For the first time, I understood with complete clarity that I was trapped in something that had nothing to do with Jehovah or the Bible or spiritual education. When it was over, when Raymond had restored his spiritual facade and reminded me about the importance of discretion and obedience, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, and finally understanding the truth. I was being abused by an elder, and no one would believe me if I told them. The moment everything changed came on a Saturday morning in March, 3 weeks before my 17th birthday. It was one of those early spring days when the Iowa wind still carried winter's bite, but the sun was warm enough to make you believe that better days were coming. Mother had left early for a special pioneer meeting that would last most of the day, and I was in the kitchen making breakfast when I heard Raymond's footsteps on the stairs. He was dressed for field service. His second-best suit, the brown one with the narrow tie that made him look scholarly and respectable. But there was something different about his demeanor that morning, something more urgent, more aggressive than his usual careful approach to what he called our spiritual instruction. "Evelyn," he said, not even bothering with his usual pleasantries, "we need to talk. Now." I felt that familiar tightening in my stomach, the Pavlovian response that his presence had trained into me over the past 2 years. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the fact that I was almost 17 now, old enough to start thinking about baptism and marriage and a future that suddenly seemed impossible while living under Raymond's control. Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying this secret for so long. Or maybe it was simply that some part of me had finally reached its breaking point. "I don't want to have a study today," I said, my voice stronger than I'd intended. "I have homework to finish for school." Raymond's expression darkened. "School?" he said, the word dripping with disdain. "Since when do worldly assignments take priority over spiritual instruction? You're becoming rebellious, Evelyn. Worldly education is filling your head with prideful ideas." He moved closer to me, and I could see something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not just the calculated manipulation I'd grown accustomed to, but actual anger, real frustration that his control was being questioned. "Sit down," he commanded, pointing to one of our kitchen chairs. "We're going to discuss your attitude problem right now." For the first time in 2 years, I didn't obey immediately. I stood there, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, and I said the words that would change everything. "No." Raymond's face went completely still. For a moment, we just stared at each other across our small kitchen, and I could see him recalculating, trying to decide how to respond to this unprecedented act of defiance. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. I said no. My voice was shaking, but I kept talking. "I don't want to have our studies anymore. I don't want you to touch me anymore. I want you to leave me alone." Raymond was quiet for a long moment, and then he began to laugh. It wasn't the warm, brotherly laugh that the congregation knew. It was something cold and calculating that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Evelyn," he said, shaking his head as if I just said something incredibly naive. "You think you have a choice in this? You think you can just decide to stop receiving spiritual instruction from an elder?" He moved closer, and I backed against the kitchen counter, my hands gripping the edge behind me. "Let me explain something to you," Raymond continued, his voice taking on that patient instructional tone that I'd learned to fear. "You've been receiving very special attention from me for over 2 years now. Very intimate, very personal attention. Do you think Mother is going to believe that her precious son, her respected elder son, has been doing anything inappropriate with his little sister?" My heart was racing, but I managed to whisper, "It's the truth." "The truth?" Raymond laughed again. "The truth is that you've been alone in your bedroom with me, behind closed doors, for hours at a time, for over 2 years. The truth is that Mother left you in my care because she trusted me to help with your spiritual development. The truth is that if you tell anyone about our special studies, everyone will assume that you're the one who initiated things. You're the one who seduced your older brother." The words hit me like physical blows. In all my teenage confusion and fear, I had never considered how our situation might look to others, how the very secrecy that Raymond had insisted upon could be turned against me. "You're 17 years old, Evelyn," Raymond continued relentlessly. "Old enough to be baptized, old enough to get married, old enough to know right from wrong. If you tell anyone about our studies, everyone will assume you were a willing participant. They'll assume you enjoyed it. They'll assume you wanted it." I was crying now, tears streaming down my face as the full magnitude of my trap became clear. Raymond had been careful, so careful, to create a situation where I would be as implicated as he was, where my own silence over 2 years would be seen as evidence of consent. "And even if someone did believe you," Raymond pressed on, "what do you think would happen then? Mother would be devastated. She'd lose her standing in the congregation. She'd be marked as the woman who raised a daughter seductive enough to corrupt an elder. The congregation would be torn apart by scandal. Dozens of people would be stumbled from the truth. He reached out and touched my face, wiping away my tears with the same gentle gesture that the congregation found so caring and paternal. Is that what you want, Evelyn? Do you want to destroy Mother's faith? Do you want to be responsible for stumbling weak ones from the truth? Do you want to bring reproach on Jehovah's name? But something had broken inside me that morning, and even Raymond's carefully constructed threats couldn't put it back together. Looking at him standing there in our kitchen, using Jehovah's name to justify his abuse, using the organization's teachings to keep me silent, I finally saw him clearly for what he was. "You're not an elder," I said, my voice growing stronger even through my tears. "Elders don't do what you've been doing. Elders protect people. They don't hurt children. They don't use the Bible to justify—" I struggled to find words for things I'd never been allowed to name. "What you've been doing isn't spiritual instruction. It's something else. Something wrong." Raymond's careful mask slipped completely then. The gentle spiritual facade disappeared, and for the first time, I saw the real person underneath. Someone who was angry at being challenged, frustrated at losing control, and absolutely determined to maintain his position at any cost. "You stupid little girl," he said, his voice no longer gentle or paternal. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You have no idea what the consequences will be if you try to spread lies about me. I'm a respected elder in this congregation. I've been serving Jehovah faithfully for years. Who do you think people are going to believe? Me or a confused teenage girl with a history of being rebellious and worldly?" But his anger only confirmed what I had finally allowed myself to understand. What Raymond had been doing to me wasn't from Jehovah, wasn't spiritual instruction, wasn't anything except one person using power and authority to hurt another person. "I'm going to tell," I said, the words coming out in a rush before I could stop them. "I'm going to tell Mother. I'm going to tell the other elders. I'm going to tell everyone." Raymond stared at me for a long moment, and then he smiled. The same warm, brotherly smile that he used from the platform during congregation meetings. "No, Evelyn," he said quietly. "You're not going to tell anyone. Because if you do, I'll make sure that everyone knows you were a willing participant. I'll make sure they know you enjoyed every minute of our special studies. I'll make sure your reputation is so thoroughly destroyed that you'll never be able to show your face in any kingdom hall anywhere." But for the first time in 2 years, his threats didn't work. Something fundamental had shifted inside me, and I realized that no matter what consequences I faced, they couldn't be worse than continuing to live under Raymond's control. "Then I'll leave," I said. "I'll leave the organization. I'll leave everything." And in that moment, standing in our kitchen with tears streaming down my face and my heart pounding with terror and determination, I made the choice that would define the rest of my life. I chose freedom over safety. I chose truth over acceptance. I chose my own voice over Raymond's authority, even if it cost me everything I'd ever known. The confrontation with Raymond changed everything, but not in the way I had imagined it would. In my 17-year-old mind, I had somehow believed that speaking the truth would automatically set me free, that naming what had happened to me would somehow make it stop. What I discovered instead was that telling the truth was only the beginning of a much longer, more complicated journey toward freedom. 3 days after our kitchen confrontation, I finally found the courage to approach Mother. She was in the living room, mending one of Raymond's shirts with the careful attention she gave to everything connected to theocratic activities. The evening light was filtering through our thin curtains, and she was humming quietly, one of the kingdom songs we sang at every meeting. "Mother," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I need to talk to you about something important." She looked up from her mending, her face brightening with that gentle smile she always wore when she thought one of her children needed spiritual guidance. "Of course, sweetheart. Sit down. Is this about your baptism preparation? Brother Patterson mentioned that you haven't been turning in field service reports regularly." I sat down across from her, my hands trembling in my lap, and tried to find words for something I'd never been allowed to name. "It's about Raymond," I began. "Oh?" Mother's smile widened. "What about Raymond? Has he been giving you extra help with your Bible study? He's so good with young people." "Mother, Raymond has been... I stopped, swallowed hard, tried again. During our private Bible studies, Raymond has been doing things that don't feel right. Things that aren't in any of our publications. The change in Mother's expression was immediate and devastating. The warm smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and defensive that I'd never seen before. "Evelyn Margaret Foster," she said, her voice sharp with warning. "What exactly are you trying to say?" "He touches me," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "In places he shouldn't touch. He says it's spiritual instruction, but it hurts and it feels wrong, and I don't think Jehovah would want—" "Stop!" Mother's voice was like a slap. She set down her mending and stared at me with an expression of such shock and disgust that I felt physically sick. "Stop right there. Do you have any idea what you're saying? Do you understand what you're accusing your brother of?" "I'm not accusing," I said desperately. "I'm just telling you what's been happening. For over 2 years now, every time you leave the house." 2 years? Mother's voice rose to a pitch I'd never heard before. "You're telling me that for 2 years you've been doing things with Raymond, and you're just now mentioning it?" The way she phrased it, doing things with Raymond instead of Raymond has been doing things to you, told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to end. But I pressed on anyway, desperate to make her understand. "I wasn't doing anything," I said, tears streaming down my face. "He said it was spiritual instruction. He said I had to obey because he's an elder. He said nobody would believe me if I told." Mother stood up abruptly, her face white with rage. "And he was right," she said coldly. "Nobody is going to believe such a ridiculous, disgusting story. Raymond is a respected elder, Evelyn. He's dedicated his entire life to serving Jehovah. He's given talks at circuit assemblies. He's counseled troubled families. He's been a spiritual pillar in this congregation for years." She began pacing around our small living room, and I could see her mind working, trying to make sense of what I'd told her in a way that wouldn't destroy her understanding of her perfect son. "This is what happens," she said finally, "when young people spend too much time in worldly environments. School is filling your head with ideas about things that shouldn't even be in a Christian girl's mind. You're misinterpreting normal spiritual guidance. You're turning innocent instruction into something perverted because that's what worldly people do. Mother, please," I begged. "Just ask him. Ask Raymond about our private studies. Ask him why they have to be secret. Ask him what kind of spiritual instruction requires." "I will not subject my son to such degrading questions based on the confused fantasies of a teenage girl," Mother interrupted. "Raymond has sacrificed years of his life to help with your spiritual development because I asked him to, because you were struggling with rebellion and worldly influences. And this is how you repay his kindness? By creating 6 stories about inappropriate conduct?" The conversation continued for another hour, but it was clear from the beginning that Mother had already decided what she was going to believe. In her mind, Raymond was incapable of the things I was describing. Therefore, I must be lying, or confused, or influenced by worldly thinking, or some combination of all 3. "You will never mention this again," Mother said finally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a final decision. "You will apologize to Raymond for even thinking such things, and you will increase your meeting attendance and field service to help overcome whatever spiritual weakness is causing these thoughts." That night, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling and finally understanding the full magnitude of my isolation. The one person who should have protected me had chosen to protect my abuser instead. The organization that claimed to be God's channel of communication on earth had created a system where predators could operate with impunity as long as they maintained the right appearance of spirituality. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in our house became increasingly tense. Mother treated me with a cold distance that was somehow worse than anger. Raymond continued his attempts to corner me for Bible studies, but now his threats were more explicit. "Mother doesn't believe you," he reminded me during one encounter. "Nobody believes you. And now everyone knows you're the kind of girl who makes up perverted stories about spiritual men. Do you think any decent brother in the congregation is going to want to marry you after this?" But something had changed in me during that confrontation in the kitchen. Raymond's threats no longer had the same power they'd once held. I had spoken the truth. even though it wasn't believed. I had named what was happening to me, even though it was rejected. And in doing so, I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my own voice. I began staying late at school, joining study groups and extracurricular activities that kept me away from home. I volunteered for extra shifts at the part-time job I'd gotten at the local grocery store. I found ways to ensure that I was never alone in the house with Raymond. When Mother confronted me about my decreased meeting attendance, I told her I was studying for college entrance exams. When she objected to my worldly activities, I reminded her that I was old enough to make my own decisions about my spiritual development. "You're becoming everything I feared," Mother said during one particularly heated argument. "Worldly, rebellious, unsubmissive. I don't even recognize my own daughter anymore." "Good," I said, and I meant it. The daughter you recognized was being abused, and nobody cared enough to protect her. The breaking point came when Raymond was given a part on a circuit assembly program. I watched from the audience as he delivered a talk about protecting the spiritual purity of young people in the congregation, about the importance of proper supervision and appropriate boundaries in spiritual instruction. The applause was thunderous. People nodded approvingly at his wisdom and spiritual insight. Several young mothers approached him afterward to ask for advice about their own children's spiritual development. And I realized that this was how the system worked. Abusers weren't monsters hiding in dark corners. They were respected members of the community, people with excellent reputations and spiritual credentials. They operated in plain sight, protected by their positions and the organization's reluctance to believe that such people could be capable of harm. That night, I made a decision that would change the course of my entire life. I was going to leave, not just Raymond and Mother, but the entire organization. I was going to walk away from everything I'd ever known and create a new life where my voice mattered, where truth was more important than reputation, where protecting victims was more important than protecting institutions. I was 18 years old, I had $57 in my savings account, and I had no idea how I was going to survive in the world outside the only community I'd ever known. But I knew I couldn't survive another day in a place where speaking the truth made me the problem, where my abuser was honored while I was silenced, where spiritual protection was just another phrase for institutional cover-up. The girl who had been taught to be silent and submissive was about to discover what her own voice could do. I left Cedar Rapids on a gray Tuesday morning in October, 3 weeks after my 18th birthday. Everything I owned fit into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box that I carried to the Greyhound station, while Mother was at her Tuesday morning field service group. I left a letter on the kitchen table, not because I thought it would change anything, but because some part of me still believed that people deserved explanations, even when they'd refused to listen to the truth. "I'm leaving," the letter said, "not because I don't love you, but because staying would mean accepting that my voice doesn't matter, that my truth isn't worth protecting, that my safety is less important than preserving someone else's reputation. I hope someday you'll understand that protecting Raymond was the same as sacrificing me." I never received a response to that letter. According to the organization's rules, I had become an apostate by walking away, which meant that any contact with me could contaminate Mother's spiritual standing. For her, I had ceased to exist the moment I chose truth over loyalty to the organization. The first years were harder than anything I could have imagined. I moved to Chicago with no family support, no network of friends, no understanding of how the world worked outside the insular community I'd been raised in. I worked multiple jobs, cleaning offices at night, serving coffee during morning shifts, stocking shelves at a grocery store on weekends. I lived in a tiny studio apartment that cost more than half my income, and I learned to navigate a world that operated by rules I'd never been taught. But slowly, carefully, I began to rebuild myself from the ground up. I enrolled in community college classes, studying psychology and social work with a particular focus on trauma recovery. I began attending a support group for survivors of religious abuse, where I met other people who understood the peculiar pain of being betrayed by organizations that claimed to represent God's love. "You have to grieve twice," explained Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the therapist who helped me through those early years. "You have to grieve what was done to you, and you have to grieve the loss of everything you believed about the world. It's like losing your entire identity and having to build a new one from scratch." She was right. For years, I struggled with basic questions that most people never have to ask. How do you trust your own judgment when you've been taught that questioning authority is spiritually dangerous? How do you form healthy relationships when your primary model for authority figures involves manipulation and abuse? How do you maintain faith in goodness when the people who claim to represent God use that claim to justify harm? The healing came slowly, in layers. First came the recognition that what Raymond had done to me wasn't spiritual instruction. It was sexual abuse, plain and simple, regardless of the religious language he'd used to disguise it. Then came the understanding that Mother's refusal to believe me wasn't a reflection of my credibility, but of a system that prioritized institutional reputation over individual safety. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that speaking the truth, even when it isn't believed, even when it costs you everything, is never a mistake. Truth has its own power, its own value, regardless of how others respond to it. I spent 15 years working as a counselor specializing in religious trauma, helping other survivors navigate the complex process of healing from spiritual abuse. Many of my clients were former Jehovah's Witnesses, but others came from different religious backgrounds: fundamentalist Christians, Orthodox communities, Islamic families, Mormon households. The details varied, but the patterns were remarkably consistent. Authoritarian structures that discouraged questioning, leaders who used religious authority to justify inappropriate behavior, and victims who were silenced through shame, fear, and institutional pressure. The hardest part, one of my clients told me during a session, isn't even what happened to me. It's knowing that speaking up would have meant losing everyone I loved. It's having to choose between truth and belonging. I understood that choice intimately. It's the choice I made when I was 18 years old, standing in that Greyhound station with everything I owned in 2 suitcases, choosing an uncertain future over a familiar hell. When I was 35, I received unexpected news. Mother had passed away from cancer. The information came through a former neighbor who'd tracked me down through the social services agency where I worked. She told me that Mother had asked about me during her final weeks, wondering if I was safe, if I was happy, if I had found peace in my life away from the organization. She never said she was wrong about what happened, the neighbor told me gently. But I think she understood, toward the end, that losing you was the greatest tragedy of her life. I attended Mother's funeral from the back of the Kingdom Hall, watching from a distance as the community I'd once belonged to celebrated her life of faithful service. Raymond was there, grayer now, but still carrying himself with the same authoritative bearing that had once terrified me. He was introduced as one of our most respected elders, and several people spoke about his decades of faithful service to the congregation. I felt no anger watching him that day, just a profound sadness for all the lives that had been shaped by lies, all the truths that had been buried to preserve appearances, all the victims who had been sacrificed to protect institutional reputation. After the service, as people were leaving, an elderly woman approached me. I recognized her as Sister Evans, one of the few people who had been kind to me during my childhood in the organization. "Evelyn?" she said hesitantly. "Is that really you?" I nodded, unsure how she would respond to seeing someone who had been officially shunned for over 20 years. "I've thought about you so many times over the years," she said quietly. "Wondered if you were all right, if you'd found happiness. Your mother, she missed you terribly." She never said so publicly, but I could see it in her eyes every time someone mentioned your name. Then she said something that caught me completely off guard. "There were others, you know. Other young people who left around the same time you did. A pattern that some of us began to notice, though we were never allowed to discuss it openly." I stared at her, processing the implications of what she was telling me. "Others?" 3 other families lost children who made similar accusations before leaving the organization, Sister Evans said, glancing around nervously to make sure no one could overhear us. The elders said it was a sign of the times that young people were becoming more rebellious and worldly. But some of us wondered. Some of us had questions we weren't allowed to ask. For the first time in over 2 decades, I felt a flicker of vindication. Not because I needed validation. I'd learned to trust my own truth long ago. But because it confirmed that my voice, even when it was rejected, had planted seeds that continued to grow in unexpected places. Today, I'm 70 years old. I've been married for 28 years to a man who knows my entire story and loves me, not despite my scars, but including them. We have 2 daughters who were raised to trust their own voices, to question authority when necessary, and to understand that institutions are only as trustworthy as their willingness to protect the vulnerable. I still have difficult days, anniversaries that bring back unexpected grief, news stories about religious abuse that reopen old wounds, moments when I wonder what my life might have been like if I'd been believed and protected instead of silenced and blamed. But I also have something that my 17-year-old self couldn't have imagined: peace. The kind of deep, abiding peace that comes from living authentically, from speaking truth regardless of consequences, from choosing healing over hiding. To anyone who might be listening to this story while living in their own version of my nightmare, your voice matters. Your truth is valid. Your safety is more important than anyone else's reputation. Speaking up may cost you everything you think you can't live without, but staying silent will cost you something even more precious: your own sense of worth and dignity. The hardest truth I learned is that sometimes protecting yourself means accepting that you can't protect the people you love from the consequences of their own choices. Sometimes saving yourself means watching others choose to remain in dangerous situations rather than face uncomfortable truths. But your freedom is not responsible for other people's captivity. Your healing is not responsible for other people's wounds. Your truth is not responsible for other people's lies. I'm 70 years old, and I still hear Raymond's voice sometimes in the quiet moments between sleep and waking. But it no longer has power over me. It's just an echo from a past I survived, a reminder of how far I've traveled from that frightened girl who thought she had no choice but to submit to abuse disguised as spiritual instruction. This is a real story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you also have a story you'd like to share, please write in the comments. We'd be very happy to tell your story on our channel.